Your hand moves before your mind can stop it. The crack of palm against cheek echoes through the red drawing room like a gunshot in a cathedral, sharp and unforgiving against the silk-covered walls and priceless paintings. The security guard's head snaps to the side, his hand rising instinctively to his reddening face, eyes wide with shock and something else. Fear, perhaps, or recognition that something irreversible has just occurred. The room falls into a silence so complete you can hear the tick of the ormolu clock on the mantelpiece, each second stretching into eternity. From your peripheral vision, you catch the other staff members frozen mid-motion. Private Secretary Henderson with his pen suspended above a notepad, Lady Susan clutching the guest list for tomorrow's state dinner, two junior courtiers who had been arranging flowers now statue still beside the mahogany table. Then comes the sound that will haunt you for weeks afterward, the scrape of Charles's chair against the marble floor as he stands. Slowly, deliberately. The leather of his seat exhales a soft sigh as he rises to his full height, and you feel rather than see every pair of eyes in the room pivot toward him like compass needles finding magnetic north. What will the king do when his queen has just struck a palace guard? The morning had begun like any other in the life of a queen consort, though that phrase still felt strange on your tongue even after all these months. The transition from the Duchess of Cornwall to Queen Camilla had been seamless in name only. Beneath the surface, every day brought fresh challenges of protocol, expectation, and the ever-present weight of public scrutiny that had never quite lifted from your shoulders, even after decades in the royal sphere. You had married into this life knowing full well its complexities. Charles had been honest about that from the beginning. Well, as honest as one could be about a world that operated by rules written in invisible ink, where a misplaced curtsy or an ill-timed smile could become front-page news. The transformation from private citizen to royal consort had taken years of careful cultivation, public appearances designed to soften your image, charity work that showcased your genuine passions while serving the crown's broader purposes. The British public had been slow to accept you, and understandably so. You had, after all, been the other woman in the most famous love triangle of the late 20th century. Diana's shadow had loomed large over your early years with Charles, and even now, at official functions, you sometimes caught that flicker of comparison in people's eyes. Would she have done it differently? Would she have been more graceful, more beloved, more naturally royal? But you had persevered, as you always had. Resilience was perhaps your greatest asset. That and the ability to weather storms that would have broken lesser spirits. The British press had thrown everything they had at you over the years, and still you stood. Still you smiled at garden parties and ribbon cuttings. Still you remembered the names of minor dignitaries and their wives. Still you performed the careful ballet of royal duty with increasing confidence. Charles had been your anchor through it all. His belief in you, his quiet support during the darkest moments of public criticism, his gentle guidance as you learned to navigate a world where every gesture was scrutinized and every word potentially weaponized. He had chosen you over the easier path, over public opinion, over the advice of courtiers who believed the crown would be safer, with a more traditional choice. That knowledge had sustained you through years of proving yourself worthy of his faith. The palace security apparatus was a complex organism that most of the public never glimpsed beyond the familiar figures of the guards in their red tunics and bearskin hats. Behind the pageantry lay a sophisticated network of protection officers, surveillance systems, and protocols developed over centuries to keep the royal family safe from threats both foreign and domestic. Personal protection officers underwent rigorous vetting and training that could take months to complete. They learned not just combat techniques and threat assessment, but also the subtle art of invisible presence, how to protect without intruding, how to maintain security while preserving the illusion of normalcy that royal life required. The best officers became like shadows, present but unnoticed, their eyes constantly scanning for potential dangers while their charges went about the business of monarchy. The hierarchy within palace security was strictly maintained. Senior protection officers reported to the Royal Protection Command, which itself answered to the Metropolitan Police, while maintaining close coordination with MI5 for intelligence matters. Each member of the royal family was assigned a dedicated team, with assignments rotating according to schedules known only to the most senior security coordinators. But for all their training and professionalism, protection officers were still human beings working in close proximity to their charges for hours each day. They witnessed private moments, overheard personal conversations, saw the royals at their most vulnerable. The psychological pressure of maintaining appropriate boundaries while performing such intimate protection duties was immense, and occasionally, inevitably, those boundaries became blurred. This morning had started with the usual cascade of briefings. State dinners required weeks of preparation, with guest lists scrutinized for diplomatic sensitivities, seating arrangements that balanced protocol with political necessity, and security assessments for each attendee. The upcoming dinner would host the President of France and his wife, along with 24 other dignitaries, business leaders, and cultural figures deemed worthy of royal hospitality. You had been reviewing the final details when Officer Matthews approached your desk. He was new to your protection detail, perhaps 6 weeks into the assignment, a tall man in his early 30s with the kind of military bearing that suggested Special Forces background. His credentials were impeccable, his record spotless, but something about his manner had been troubling you in recent days. It wasn't anything you could put your finger on precisely. Perhaps it was the way his eyes lingered a moment too long when he thought you weren't looking, or how he positioned himself just slightly closer than necessary during walkabouts. Professional protection required proximity, yes, but there was proximity, and then there was presumption, and Matthews seemed increasingly comfortable crossing lines that should have remained firmly drawn. The day's schedule had been particularly demanding. Charles was dealing with a constitutional question about parliamentary procedure that required careful consultation with government ministers, while you had 3 separate charity engagements before the evening's state dinner preparations. The weight of continuous public performance, even after all these years, could be exhausting in ways that outsiders rarely understood. Every royal appearance was a performance, carefully choreographed and flawlessly executed. Spontaneity was a luxury the monarchy could rarely afford. Even seemingly casual moments were often planned weeks in advance. The emotional labor of maintaining perfect composure, of being perpetually on for the cameras and the public, took its toll in ways that the palace wellness protocols were only beginning to acknowledge. Charles, for his part, had been king for just over 2 years, and the adjustment had been more challenging than either of you had anticipated. As Prince of Wales, he had been preparing for the throne his entire life. But the reality of monarchy, the endless constitutional responsibilities, the diplomatic obligations, the weight of being the symbolic head of not just Britain but the Commonwealth realms, had proven more isolating than even he had expected. His days began before dawn, with briefings from private secretaries about parliamentary business, diplomatic communications, and the dozens of decisions that required royal input or approval. By the time you saw him in the mornings, he had already been working for hours, his breakfast taken alone in his study, while reviewing documents marked with the distinctive red boxes that contained state papers requiring immediate attention. The loneliness of command was something Charles rarely discussed, but you could see it in the way his shoulders carried tension that no amount of massage could release, in how his smiles at public events never quite reached his eyes, in the moments of silence that stretched between you when the day's performances were finally complete and you were, briefly, just 2 people navigating an impossible life together. "Ma'am," Matthews had said, approaching your desk with a folder tucked under his arm. "I need to review the security arrangements for this evening's dinner." Protocol dictated that such reviews were handled by the senior protection officer or, in matters of particular sensitivity, by the private secretary's office directly. Matthews was neither, and his presumption in approaching you directly was the first breach of proper procedure. "Surely that's a matter for Commander Williams," you had replied, not looking up from the seating chart you were reviewing. The placement of the French president's economic advisor had been causing diplomatic headaches for days. "Commander Williams is indisposed, ma'am. Food poisoning, apparently." Matthews stepped closer, setting the folder on your desk without invitation. "These security protocols require your immediate attention." There was something in his tone, too familiar, too presumptuous, that made you look up. He was standing closer than appropriate, close enough that you could smell his cologne, see the small scar near his left temple that suggested a history more complex than his service record indicated. "Officer Matthews," you said carefully, "I believe these matters should be directed to—" "Ma'am," he interrupted, and the interruption itself was another violation. "With respect, I think you'll want to handle this personally. Some of the guests on tonight's list have interesting backgrounds, the kind that might embarrass the Crown if proper precautions aren't taken." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Here was a junior protection officer suggesting that you, the Queen Consort, were somehow negligent in your duties, that your judgment couldn't be trusted with matters of state. The condescension was breathtaking in its audacity. "I beg your pardon?" Your voice carried the ice that years of public criticism had taught you to summon when necessary. Matthews leaned closer, his voice dropping to what he probably imagined was a conspiratorial whisper. "Between you and me, ma'am, some of these foreign dignitaries have connections that might reflect poorly on your judgment, given your history with questionable associations." The words hit like a physical blow. Your history, the barely veiled reference to your past, to the years of public shame and rebuilding, to the careful work of earning a place in this family and this institution. The suggestion that you remained, fundamentally, an outsider whose judgment couldn't be trusted. Your hand moved before your mind could engage the careful controls you had spent decades perfecting. The slap was sharp, precise, and utterly satisfying in the moment before horror flooded in to replace the anger. Matthews staggered back, his hand flying to his cheek, eyes wide with shock and what might have been calculation. The folder scattered its contents across the Persian rug, photographs of dinner guests, security assessments, and what looked suspiciously like personal information that had no business being in a junior officer's possession. The silence that followed was broken only by the soft, leather-on-marble sound of Charles rising from his chair near the window where he had been reviewing his own papers. You turned towards your husband, your hand still tingling from the impact, your heart hammering against your ribs as the enormity of what you had just done crashed over you like a cold wave. Every person in the room was frozen in tableau, waiting for the king's response to an unprecedented situation. In that moment, you realized that your marriage, your role in the monarchy, and Charles's own reign hung in the balance of whatever he said next. Royal protection protocols, developed over decades of evolving threats and refined through hard experience, were unambiguous about conduct between security personnel and their charges. Officers were trained to maintain professional distance at all times, to avoid any behavior that could be interpreted as overly familiar or presumptuous. Personal conversations were strictly limited to operational matters, and any suggestion of inappropriate conduct was to be reported immediately through proper channels. The psychological screening for royal protection duties included extensive evaluation of officers' ability to work in close proximity to high-profile individuals without developing inappropriate attachments or demonstrating boundary issues. The intimate nature of protection work, Shadowing individuals through their most private moments, witnessing family conflicts and personal vulnerabilities, required exceptional emotional discipline and professional judgment. Incidents involving physical contact between royals and security personnel were virtually unknown in modern palace history. The protocols governing such situations had been developed largely in theory, based on worst-case scenarios rather than actual events. The assumption had always been that any such incident would involve a security threat to the royal person, not the reverse. When such extraordinary situations did arise, the first priority was always damage control and discretion. Senior palace officials were trained to contain information, manage witnesses, and coordinate with legal counsel to determine appropriate responses. The protection of the institution took precedence over individual consequences, though this principle had never been tested in quite these circumstances. Charles stood motionless for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds, his expression unreadable in the way that decades of public life had taught him to master. His silence stretched across the room like a taut wire, and you found yourself holding your breath, waiting for his judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the measured tone he used for the most delicate diplomatic situations. "Officer Matthews, I believe you've forgotten yourself." The words were quiet, but they carried the authority of centuries of monarchy, delivered with the kind of understated power that reminded everyone present exactly who they were addressing. Charles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The rebuke was absolute and unmistakable. "Your Majesty, Matthews began, but Charles cut him off with a slight raise of his hand. "You will report to Commander Williams immediately for reassignment. Your service to this household is concluded." Charles's eyes never left Matthews' face. "Henderson, please escort Officer Matthews from the room and ensure proper procedures are followed." Private Secretary Henderson moved with practiced efficiency, guiding the stunned officer toward the door while maintaining the kind of diplomatic smooth handling that made crises disappear without apparent effort. The other staff members resumed their activities with careful normalcy, though you could feel their sideways glances and sense their internal calculations about what they had witnessed. Charles waited until the door closed before turning his full attention to you. His expression had softened almost imperceptibly, but you could read the concern in his eyes, the question he couldn't ask in front of others. "Are you all right?" You nodded slightly, understanding the communication that passed between you. Later, when privacy allowed, there would be conversation about what had happened, about the officer's inappropriate behavior, and your response to it. But for now, in this moment, Charles had chosen to protect you first and deal with the institutional implications second. "Lady Susan," Charles said, his tone returning to business normalcy, "perhaps we should review the security arrangements for this evening's dinner. I want to ensure we have appropriate personnel in place." Life in the palace resumed its careful rhythm, but something fundamental had shifted. The other staff members had witnessed something unprecedented. A moment when the human beings beneath the royal titles had broken through the careful protocol that usually contained them. More importantly, they had seen their king choose loyalty over expedience, marriage over monarchy, at least in this crucial first response. But you knew, even as normal activity resumed around you, that this incident would not simply disappear. Palace life had its own gravitational force that drew secrets from the shadows and transformed private moments into public scandals. Someone had witnessed what happened, and someone would eventually talk. The question was not whether the story would emerge, but when, and how Charles would respond when the choice between protecting you and protecting the crown became impossible to avoid. Historical precedent offered little guidance for situations involving royal misconduct toward staff members. The monarchy had weathered scandals before, affairs, divorces, financial improprieties, but those had typically involved external relationships or personal failings that could be managed through careful public relations strategies. Physical altercations within the palace walls fell into uncharted territory. Previous royal crises had demonstrated the institution's remarkable capacity for survival through adaptation. The abdication crisis of 1936, the divorce scandals of the 1990s, and various minor controversies over the decades had all been navigated through careful management of public perception, strategic timing of revelations, and the monarchy's ultimate ability to evolve with changing social expectations. The palace's approach to crisis management had become increasingly sophisticated over the decades. A dedicated communications team worked closely with both traditional media and newer digital platforms to shape narratives, manage timing of announcements, and coordinate responses across all royal households. The institution had learned hard lessons about the cost of appearing out of touch or unresponsive to public concerns. Yet, all of these precedents involved scenarios where the royal family could be positioned as either victims of circumstance or leaders taking difficult but necessary actions for the greater good. The current situation presented a more complex challenge: how to manage a story where a senior royal appeared to be the aggressor in an inappropriate incident. The afternoon passed in a blur of final preparations for the evening's state dinner. You moved through the familiar routines, reviewing menu details with the head chef, confirming floral arrangements, checking the placement of gifts that would be exchanged with the French delegation, but your mind remained fixed on the morning's incident and its potential consequences. Charles had returned to his study after the morning's confrontation, and you hadn't spoken privately since. This was not unusual. State dinner days required separate, parallel preparations that often kept you apart until the evening's formal events began. But the silence felt different today, weighted with unspoken concerns about what lay ahead. You had learned over the years to read Charles's moods through subtle indicators invisible to outside observers. The way he held his shoulders when political pressures mounted, the particular set of his jaw when constitutional questions arose that had no clear answers, the slight tension around his eyes when personal and public duties came into conflict. This afternoon, when you glimpsed him during a brief corridor encounter, all of these signs were present simultaneously. Lady Susan had been uncharacteristically quiet since the morning's incident. As one of your most trusted ladies-in-waiting, she had witnessed enough royal dramas to understand the potential implications of what had occurred. Her discretion was unquestionable. She had served the royal household for nearly 15 years without a single breach of confidence, but her subdued manner suggested she understood the gravity of the situation. The evening's state dinner proceeded with flawless precision that belied the morning's turmoil. You stood beside Charles in the receiving line, greeting each guest with practiced warmth while photographers captured images that would appear in tomorrow's papers. The President of France was gracious and charming, his wife elegant in a way that reminded you why French women had a reputation for effortless sophistication. Through 4 courses of exquisite cuisine and carefully orchestrated conversation, you performed your role with the expertise that years of practice had provided. You discussed the president's wife's charitable work with genuine interest, laughed at the appropriate moments during diplomatic small talk, and ensured that every guest felt properly welcomed and valued. But beneath the surface performance, your mind was working through scenarios and their potential consequences. Palace life operated on the principle that private indiscretions could be managed as long as they remained private. The household staff understood their obligations of discretion, bound by contracts and traditions that made unauthorized revelations career-ending mistakes. Yet you also understood the economics of royal scandal. A story like this, Queen Camilla striking a palace guard, would be worth enormous sums to the right media outlet. The temptation for someone with access to the information would be substantial, particularly if financial pressures or personal grudges provided additional motivation. Charles seemed to sense your distraction despite your polished performance. During a brief lull between courses, He placed his hand over yours with the kind of casual affection that the photographers would capture as evidence of marital harmony, but his touch carried reassurance meant for you alone. "We'll manage whatever comes," he murmured, his words barely audible beneath the dinner conversation flowing around you. The simple statement carried the weight of shared experience, all the previous crises you had weathered together, all the challenges that had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened your partnership. The dinner concluded with toasts that praised Franco-British cooperation and friendship, with cultural exchanges that would strengthen ties between the nations, with all the diplomatic pleasantries that made such events valuable beyond their social aspects. As the guests departed with their small gifts and warm memories of royal hospitality, you allowed yourself a moment of satisfaction at another successful diplomatic gathering. But the satisfaction was short-lived. As you and Charles retired to your private apartments, Henderson appeared with the expression that senior palace staff reserved for delivering unwelcome news. "Your Majesty, ma'am," he said with careful formality. "There's been a development regarding this morning's incident. We've received an inquiry from a journalist at The Sun. They claim to have information about an altercation between Her Majesty and a security officer." The bottom dropped out of your stomach. The careful world of palace privacy had been breached, and the machinery of scandal was already beginning to turn. Charles's response was immediate and decisive. "Get Williams on the phone. I want a full investigation into how this information was obtained and by whom. And get our legal team involved immediately. I want to understand our options." You watched your husband transform from dinner companion to monarch in the space of a breath. This was Charles in crisis mode, the version of him that emerged when the institution itself was threatened. His training and instincts took over, prioritizing damage control and strategic response over personal concerns. "What did the journalist say exactly?" you asked, your voice steadier than you had expected. "She claims to have a witness account of the Queen Consort striking a palace security officer in the Red Drawing Room this morning. She's asking for comment and offering an opportunity for the palace to provide context before publication, the familiar euphemisms of media crisis management. An opportunity to provide context meant the story was going to run regardless. The only question was whether the palace's version would be included or whether the narrative would be entirely controlled by unnamed sources and speculation. You found yourself thinking about Diana in that moment, about how the relentless media pressure had contributed to the tragedy that had reshaped the monarchy's relationship with publicity. The lessons learned from that experience had led to more sophisticated media strategies, but they had also created a deep wariness about the power of narrative to destroy lives and institutions. Charles was already moving into operational mode, his years of experience with media crises evident in the systematic way he began addressing the situation. Phone calls to senior advisors, coordination with the palace communications team, strategic discussions about timing and messaging that would minimize damage to both your personal reputation and the broader institution. The next morning brought confirmation of your worst fears. The Sun's front page featured a photograph of the palace with a headline that screamed, "Camilla's Palace Slap Shock." The story itself was surprisingly detailed, suggesting either a witness more talkative than Henderson's initial investigation had revealed, or investigative work that had uncovered additional information through other channels. The narrative presented was damaging, but not entirely inaccurate. It described a verbal confrontation between you and a security officer that had escalated into physical contact, citing unnamed palace sources who expressed concern about the Queen Consort's behavior and temperament. The officer was portrayed as a dedicated professional who had been inappropriately attacked for performing his duties. What the story lacked was context. Matthew's inappropriate behavior, his boundary violations, the accumulating pattern of disrespect that had preceded your response. Instead, you were portrayed as volatile and unpredictable, a narrative that connected uncomfortably with older stories about your supposedly difficult personality and sense of entitlement. Charles's response surprised everyone, including you. Rather than following the traditional palace strategy of declining to comment on personnel matters, he authorized an unprecedented statement that acknowledged the incident while providing crucial context. The palace can confirm that an incident occurred involving inappropriate conduct by a security officer toward Her Majesty the Queen Consort. The officer has been removed from royal duties pending a full investigation. Her Majesty's response, while regrettable in its method, was provoked by behavior that violated professional boundaries and personal respect. The statement was carefully crafted to accomplish multiple objectives. It confirmed the basic facts to prevent speculation from filling the vacuum, it shifted responsibility toward the officer's initial misconduct, and it acknowledged your response without entirely excusing it. Most importantly, it demonstrated Charles's support for you while maintaining institutional authority. Public response was immediate and divided. Traditional monarchists expressed concern about royal dignity and proper conduct, arguing that physical responses to verbal provocations were unbecoming of the crown regardless of provocation. Republican voices used the incident to question the relevance and behavior of unelected hereditary rulers who seemed unable to manage their own staff appropriately. But a surprising counter-narrative began to emerge, particularly among women who identified with the experience of being undermined or disrespected by men in professional settings. Social media discussions revealed widespread sympathy for your position, with many arguing that the security officer's behavior warranted a stronger response than polite correction. The complexity of public opinion reflected broader cultural conversations about power dynamics, workplace harassment, and the different standards applied to men and women in positions of authority. Your slap was being interpreted through multiple lenses: royal protocol, gender dynamics, workplace behavior, and the ongoing national conversation about accountability and respect. As the story developed over subsequent days, additional details emerged that further complicated the narrative. Matthews's employment history revealed previous complaints from female colleagues about boundary issues, complaints that had apparently been managed through transfers rather than disciplinary action. His assignment to your protection detail began to look less like routine rotation and more like institutional failure to address a problematic pattern. The officer himself remained silent initially, following legal advice while investigators reviewed his conduct. But by the end of the week, facing mounting evidence of inappropriate behavior and the collapse of his palace career, he chose to speak publicly through a representative. His statement acknowledged that his approach to you had been overly familiar and disrespectful, admitting to comments and behavior that violated royal household standards. He expressed regret for creating a situation that had escalated inappropriately, effectively validating the palace's version of events while stopping short of fully excusing your physical response. The admission changed the story's trajectory significantly. Media coverage shifted from questioning your temperament to examining systemic issues within palace security and the challenges facing women in high-profile positions who must navigate disrespect while maintaining public composure. Constitutional scholars weighed in on the broader implications of the incident. The monarchy's role as a moral exemplar for the nation meant that royal conduct was held to standards that exceeded normal expectations, but those same scholars acknowledged the complex power dynamics at play when staff members overstepped professional boundaries with their royal employers. The consensus among constitutional experts was that while your response was unfortunate in its method, the underlying situation represented a more serious institutional problem that the palace needed to address comprehensively. Recommendations emerged for enhanced training programs, clearer behavioral guidelines, and more robust reporting mechanisms for inappropriate conduct. Charles navigated the crisis with the diplomatic skill that had been honed through decades of public service. He met privately with senior household officials to review security protocols, authorized an independent review of staff training and oversight procedures, and made himself available for consultation with government ministers concerned about constitutional implications. Your own role during this period was carefully managed, but not hidden. Rather than disappearing from public view, you maintained your scheduled engagements, while palace communications worked to demonstrate your continued effectiveness and public support. A visit to a domestic violence shelter provided powerful imagery that reinforced themes of standing up to inappropriate male behavior, while your interaction with young people at a youth center showed your continued ability to connect with the public. The rehabilitation strategy was subtle but effective. Instead of defending your actions directly, the palace communications team worked to broaden the conversation to address underlying issues that resonated with public experience. The incident became a launching point for discussions about workplace respect, appropriate boundaries, and the challenges facing women in leadership positions. Private polls commissioned by the palace revealed surprising results. While initial public reaction had been negative, opinion shifted as more details emerged about Matthews's conduct. A majority of respondents expressed understanding for your position, with particularly strong support among women who identified with experiences of workplace disrespect and boundary violations. The turning point came during a BBC interview 3 weeks after the incident. Charles, speaking with his characteristic thoughtfulness and precision, addressed the situation directly while placing it in broader context. Marriage is a partnership that requires mutual support, particularly when external pressures mount, he said, his words carefully chosen but delivered with genuine emotion. The Queen Consort has devoted herself to serving this country with grace and dignity, often under circumstances that would challenge anyone's composure. When that service is met with disrespect or inappropriate conduct, I will always stand with my wife. The interview moment went viral, with clips shared across social media platforms accompanied by commentary praising Charles's loyalty and support. The image of a husband defending his wife, even when her response had been imperfect, resonated with audiences who valued partnership and mutual respect in marriage. Public opinion polls showed a remarkable shift in your favor following Charles's interview. Approval ratings that had dipped immediately after the incident not only recovered, but exceeded pre-crisis levels. The narrative had evolved from "Queen loses temper" to "Royal couple demonstrates partnership under pressure." The constitutional implications proved less serious than initially feared. Government ministers, after consultation with legal advisers and constitutional experts, concluded that the incident represented a personnel matter rather than a constitutional crisis. The fact that appropriate disciplinary action had been taken, combined with procedural reforms designed to prevent similar situations, satisfied institutional concerns about royal conduct. 3 months later, you found yourself back in the Red Drawing Room, this time working alongside Charles on preparations for a Commonwealth reception. The familiar space held different energy now, still formal and magnificent, but somehow less oppressive. The incident had cleared the air in unexpected ways, establishing boundaries that had previously been assumed rather than explicitly defined. Commander Williams had implemented new training protocols that emphasized respect and professional boundaries while maintaining security effectiveness. Staff interactions felt more naturally respectful, built on clearer understanding of appropriate conduct, rather than the vague traditions that had sometimes allowed problems to develop unchecked. Charles looked up from his papers as you reviewed the guest list for the upcoming reception. "Any concerns about tonight's arrangements?" he asked, and you could hear the gentle humor in his question. "I believe I'll manage to keep my hands to myself," you replied, matching his tone. The ability to acknowledge what had happened while moving beyond it felt like a small victory, evidence that your partnership had not only survived the crisis, but emerged stronger. The incident had taught you both something important about the balance between institutional requirements and personal dignity. The monarchy demanded enormous personal sacrifice, but it need not require the complete surrender of human response to human disrespect. Finding that balance would be an ongoing challenge, but you faced it now with greater confidence in Charles's support and your own judgment. As evening approached and guests began to arrive for the Commonwealth reception, you took your place beside Charles in the receiving line. The familiar ritual of royal hospitality unfolded with practiced grace, but you carried yourself with subtly different energy, still respectful of protocol and institutional requirements, but no longer willing to sacrifice personal dignity for the appearance of perfect compliance. The story of your confrontation with Officer Matthews had become something larger than its original incident, a conversation about respect, boundaries, and the human element within institutional roles. While you would never recommend physical responses to verbal provocations, you had no regrets about refusing to accept disrespectful treatment simply because your position required public composure. Charles's silent stand that morning had communicated more than any speech about his priorities and values. In choosing to support you before addressing institutional concerns, he had demonstrated the kind of partnership that could sustain both a marriage and a monarchy through whatever challenges lay ahead. The Commonwealth guests who greeted you that evening saw a queen consort who had weathered a public crisis and emerged with dignity intact, supported by a king who understood that institutional strength sometimes required defending personal principles. The incident that had begun as a potential scandal had become, unexpectedly, a demonstration of resilience and partnership under pressure. As you moved through the evening's events, engaging with diplomats and dignitaries from across the Commonwealth realms, you reflected on the strange journey that had brought you to this point. From private citizen to royal duchess to queen consort, each transition had required learning new skills and adapting to impossible expectations. The incident with Matthews had been a reminder that beneath all the protocol and pageantry, you remained fundamentally human, capable of anger, mistake, and imperfect responses to imperfect situations. But it had also demonstrated that Charles understood this humanity and was prepared to defend it, even when defense required difficult choices. The evening concluded with the same satisfaction that always accompanied successful state events, but with an additional layer of confidence earned through trial. You had faced a genuine crisis and emerged not unscathed, but stronger and more secure in your position and your marriage. Standing in the red drawing room as the last guests departed, you found yourself thinking about the guard who had been present that morning. Not Matthews, but the others who had witnessed everything. They now knew that their queen consort was capable of very human responses to very human provocations, and that their king was capable of choosing loyalty over expedience when the situation demanded it. Perhaps, you reflected, there was something valuable in that knowledge. The monarchy's strength had always derived partly from its distance from ordinary human experience, but it also needed to maintain connection with the very human lives it symbolically represented. Finding the balance between those requirements would continue to challenge you and Charles throughout your reign. The question that had hung in the air that morning, what would the king do when his queen struck a palace guard, had been answered not just in Charles's immediate response, but in the weeks of crisis management that followed. He had chosen partnership over protocol, marriage over monarchy, at least in the moments when that choice was most clearly defined. As you prepared to leave the red drawing room for the final time that evening, you paused to look around the space where everything had changed. The silk wall coverings and priceless artwork remained unchanged, but your relationship to this room and your role within it had been fundamentally altered. You were still queen consort, still bound by the enormous responsibilities and expectations that came with that position, but you were also, irrevocably and proudly, a woman who would not accept disrespect in silence, married to a man who understood that sometimes institutional requirements must yield to human dignity. The story that would be told about this incident would evolve over time, as all royal stories did, shaped by changing perspectives and historical distance. But the truth that mattered most, that your partnership with Charles could survive imperfection and emerge stronger, had been established beyond question. In the end, perhaps that was worth all the headlines, all the scrutiny, all the complex navigation of public opinion and institutional requirements. You had learned something important about your own boundaries and Charles's priorities, lessons that would serve you well in whatever challenges lay ahead. As you turned off the lights and left the red drawing room to whatever ghosts inhabited royal spaces after dark, you carried with you the knowledge that you were not just a symbol or an institution, but a woman married to a man who would stand up for you when it mattered most. Even if, sometimes, that standing up required him to first stand up from his chair in shocked silence, calculating the cost of loyalty in a world where every gesture carried the weight of centuries and the expectations of nations.